If you've ever had to explain to your landlord why there's a raccoon-shaped hole in the balcony wall, a bidet installed backwards, or why the ceiling fan is now just a ceiling, congratulations. You're about to feel so much better about yourself. We found 49 real excuses tenants actually gave their landlords, and they will make you question everything you know about adulting in America. Drop a comment with the dumbest thing you've ever broken and tried to blame on literally anything else, and subscribe so the algorithm doesn't find out what you did to that wall. 1. A tenant once told his landlord that the wall just accepted his fist, and he simply did not want to be rude by pulling back mid-swing. But the landlord stood there blinking for a solid 10 seconds, staring at a perfectly fist-shaped hole with cracked paint spreading in every direction around it. The man looked genuinely offended that anyone would question his manners over something so reasonable. He even added that the wall seemed completely okay with it at the time, and had no complaints during the incident. 2. A young woman explained to her landlord that her emotional support ferret had developed a deep personal vendetta against baseboards, and baseboards specifically. Not the furniture, not the carpet, not the doors, just the baseboards running along every single wall throughout the entire apartment. She presented this information with complete sincerity and even pulled out a photo of the ferret sitting there, looking absolutely unbothered by the whole situation. The landlord asked why only the baseboards, and she replied that she had asked the ferret that exact question herself and never received a satisfying answer. 3. A retired man told his landlord with full confidence that the crack in the living room wall was already there before he moved in, and he had simply made it more visible by removing the paint around it with a butter knife out of curiosity. He explained that he was actually doing the landlord a favor by exposing a pre-existing structural issue that could have gone unnoticed for years. The landlord pulled out the move-in inspection report with 0 cracks listed, and the man nodded slowly, like that document was the one being unreasonable. 4. A college student sent his landlord a 3-paragraph message explaining that he had been sleepwalking recently and had apparently also been sleep renovating at the same time because he woke up to find the kitchen cabinet doors removed and stacked neatly in the hallway, and he stressed that he had absolutely no memory of doing it, and that his hands must have acted completely on their own during the night. The landlord asked how someone could unscrew cabinet hinges while fully asleep, and the student said that was exactly what made it so frightening. 5. A woman called her landlord to explain that Mercury was in retrograde that week, and that the planetary energy had physically shifted her refrigerator across the kitchen and straight into the doorframe, leaving a dent the size of a bowling ball. She said this with the calm confidence of someone reading from a science textbook. The landlord asked if she was being serious, and she replied that she would send him the astrological chart if he needed documentation. The doorframe and the landlord both had a very difficult week after that call. 6. An older gentleman informed his landlord over a very formal phone call that the ceiling fan and he had experienced a disagreement earlier that week, and that unfortunately things had escalated beyond what either of them had intended. He did not explain what the disagreement was about, or how a man and a ceiling fan arrive at physical conflict, but the fan was on the floor in 4 separate pieces when the landlord arrived. The man offered to write a brief account of events, if needed, and the landlord said he genuinely did not know where to begin with the paperwork. 7. A young woman sheepishly told her landlord that she had spotted a spider on the bathroom wall and had taken immediate action to handle the situation, but the spider had ultimately won the encounter, and she was the one who ended up with a bruised hand and a shattered bathroom mirror. She clarified that the spider escaped completely unharmed, which she found deeply unfair, given the amount of structural damage it had caused by simply existing in her bathroom on a Tuesday morning. The landlord stared at the mirror for a long time without saying anything. 8. A tenant explained to his landlord that he had searched online for instructions on how to fix a leaking pipe under the kitchen sink and had followed every single step exactly as described, and that the resulting flood was entirely the fault of the website because the information provided was factually incorrect. He had screenshots of the tutorial ready to show as evidence, and was prepared to argue that the landlord should be taking this up with the internet rather than with him. The kitchen floor had absorbed enough water to qualify as a small inland lake by the time the landlord arrived. 9. A middle-aged woman contacted her landlord to report that the toilet had been behaving aggressively toward her for several months, and that the latest incident was simply its most recent move in what she described as an ongoing personal conflict between them. She said she had done nothing to provoke it, and that the cracked tank lid was clearly the toilet acting out of spite after weeks of built-up tension. The landlord asked her to clarify what she meant by ongoing beef with a toilet, and she said some relationships are just complicated, and left it at that. 10. A young tenant responded to his landlord's concerned message about the heavily stained and partially melted carpet by explaining that it was not damage at all, but rather a vibe he had been intentionally going for in the living room. He described it as an artistic direction he had been exploring over several months, and felt the current state of the carpet actually added character to the space. The landlord sent him 3 photos of the original carpet from the move-in inspection, and the tenant replied that the before version honestly lacked personality, and he stood by his creative vision completely. 11. A woman told her landlord that her roommate had an extremely chaotic aura, and that over several months of living together, that energy had slowly transferred itself into the carpet fibers, and was now physically visible as a series of mysterious stains that no cleaning product on earth could remove. She explained this with genuine concern in her voice, like she was reporting a paranormal event rather than property damage. The landlord asked her what she thought the solution was, and she said she had already burned some sage, but was open to suggestions if he had any better ideas. 12. A man called his landlord to explain that he had been confident the wall could hold a mounted television, a fully loaded bookshelf, and his cousin Randy, all at the same time because it looked like a very sturdy wall from the outside. He said Randy was not even that heavy, and that the bookshelf was mostly paperbacks, which everyone knows are lighter than hardcovers. The landlord arrived to find a collapsed section of drywall, a television face down on the floor, and cousin Randy sitting in the kitchen, eating a sandwich like nothing had happened, which the landlord found somehow more upsetting than the damage itself. 13. A teenage boy sent his landlord a single text message that said the microwave started it, and then did not respond to any follow-up messages for the next 4 hours. When the landlord finally reached him by phone, the boy maintained that the microwave had behaved aggressively first, and that everything that followed was simply a natural consequence of that initial provocation. He refused to elaborate on what the microwave had done to start the conflict. The kitchen wall behind the microwave had a scorch mark the size of a dinner plate, and the microwave itself was unplugged and facing the corner like it had been put in timeout. 14. A woman explained to her landlord that her dog had a very complicated emotional relationship with the mailman whose daily route happened to pass directly by the front window of the apartment, and that after months of tension, the window had simply become a casualty of a conflict it never asked to be part of. She said the dog had been attending behavioral training, but that the mailman kept showing up, which was not helping the therapeutic process at all. The landlord looked at the shattered window frame, and then looked at the dog who was sitting peacefully on the couch like it had never done anything wrong in its entire life. 15. An older woman called her landlord to explain that she had spent several weeks manifesting a fireplace in her living room through daily visualization and positive intention, and that she appeared to have manifested with more force than she had anticipated because there was now a very real and very scorched area of the wall where she had been directing her energy each morning. She said she was both proud and surprised by how effective the process had been, and asked if the landlord wanted her to also manifest the repairs. The landlord asked her to please stop manifesting anything in the apartment immediately, and she said she would try her best. 16. A young man told his landlord that a moth had entered the apartment uninvited one evening and had immediately developed an unhealthy obsession with the bedside lamp, which ultimately led to a confrontation that neither the moth nor the lamp survived. He described the sequence of events in careful detail, including his own attempts to intervene, which he admitted may have accelerated the situation rather than calmed it down. The lampshade was melted on one side, the bulb was shattered across the nightstand, and the moth was nowhere to be found, which he found personally suspicious given that it started the whole thing. 17. A woman contacted her landlord in a panic, explaining that a pigeon had flown through the open balcony door and that she had reacted to the situation in a way she described as architecturally. She could not fully explain what that meant when pressed, but the evidence in the apartment suggested she had attempted to herd the pigeon using a broom, 2 couch cushions, and at some point the bathroom door, which was now hanging off a single hinge. The pigeon had left the building completely unharmed. The apartment looked like it had experienced a very targeted and very specific small disaster involving exactly one bird. 18. A man told his landlord that he had watched a single YouTube video about clearing a blocked drain and had followed the instructions with full confidence, only to discover that the drain had no intention of cooperating and had instead chosen to escalate the entire situation to the bathroom floor and then from the bathroom floor to the hallway carpet. He felt the video had oversimplified the process and that the drain deserved at least some of the blame for behaving so unreasonably during what should have been a straightforward 15-minute task. The landlord counted 4 soaked towels on the floor and said nothing for a very long time. 19. A mother explained to her landlord that her children had been playing the floor is lava game in the kitchen and had taken the concept significantly more literally than she had expected near the kitchen tiles, resulting in damage she was still piecing together from witness accounts because she had been in the next room for only 12 minutes. She said she did not know a game could become a structural liability, but that she had learned a great deal about her children that afternoon. 2 tiles were cracked, 1 was completely missing, and the kids were still insisting the game rules justified everything that had happened. 20. An uncle called his landlord to report that his mother-in-law had come to visit for the weekend and had apparently rearranged all the furniture in the apartment at some point in the middle of the night without telling anyone, and that when he woke up the next morning, the closet door was simply gone with no explanation and no sign of where it had been taken. He said he had asked her about it directly, and she had changed the subject both times. The landlord asked if the door was still somewhere in the apartment, and the uncle said he had checked every room and was starting to think she had taken it home with her as a souvenir. 21. A woman admitted to her landlord that she had been stress cleaning at 3 in the morning because she could not sleep, and that somewhere around the 4th hour, the aggression she was feeling had transferred itself directly into her cleaning technique, and the cabinet hinges had absorbed the full emotional weight of a very difficult week. She said she was not proud of it, but that the cabinets had been wobbling for months, and she felt the landlord should consider that context before forming any strong opinions. The landlord looked at 4 cabinet doors lying on the kitchen floor and gently suggested that perhaps therapy was a more appropriate outlet than hinge-based stress relief. 22. A young man sent his landlord a long voice message explaining that he had attempted to assemble a piece of IKEA furniture entirely by himself late on a Sunday night, and that at some point during the 3rd hour, his spirit had genuinely left his body, and he had returned to consciousness to find the apartment in a condition he could not fully account for. He said the instruction manual had 17 steps and no words, only diagrams, and that step 9 was clearly drawn by someone who had never seen furniture before. The landlord arrived to find a partially assembled shelf embedded in the drywall at a confident 45-degree angle. 23. A woman told her landlord that she had set up candles throughout the living room one evening with some music and a bottle of wine, and that the ventilation in the apartment was not as adequate as she had originally assumed when she moved in, and that the curtains had essentially made a decision for themselves by getting too close to the ambiance. She felt the curtains bore some personal responsibility for their own fate, given how close they had been leaning toward the candles all evening. The landlord pointed out that curtains could not make decisions, and she said that was exactly what someone who had never met these curtains would say. 24. A man explained to his landlord with complete seriousness that his weighted blanket had fallen off the edge of the loft bed during the night, and that he had not appreciated until that exact moment how much force a heavy blanket could generate When dropped from that height because the bathroom tile directly below had cracked in a pattern that looked almost deliberate, he said he had done some rough calculations afterward and believed the physics were completely on his side if the landlord wanted to review the numbers. The landlord did not want to review the numbers and said so clearly, but the man had already pulled out a notebook. 25. A woman told her landlord that she had been feeling cold one evening and had moved her space heater slightly closer to the wall for more efficient warmth, and that she did not feel the rest of the details were particularly relevant to the conversation they were currently having. The landlord asked her to please share the rest of the details, and she exhaled slowly and said there had been a brief situation involving the baseboard, and that the wall had reacted more dramatically than she had anticipated for what she described as a very minor adjustment in heating strategy. The scorch mark on the wall was 14 inches wide and shaped like a question mark, which felt appropriate. 26. A man called his landlord to report that his roommate had confidently announced he knew exactly how to patch drywall and had proceeded to demonstrate over an entire Saturday afternoon that he absolutely did not know how to patch drywall in any meaningful way. The original hole had been the size of a tennis ball and was now the size of a microwave after the roommate had spent several hours improving the situation. The man said he had tried to stop him twice, but the roommate had said he just needed a little more room to work and that things would look much better once the compound dried, which it had not. 27. An older man contacted his landlord to explain that a raccoon had appeared on the balcony one evening and that he had handled the situation himself in a manner that was completely within his legal rights, but that grace and precision had not been the defining features of the encounter. He said the raccoon had been very fast and very uncooperative, and that some of the balcony railing damage was a direct result of the evasive maneuvers both parties had been forced to make during the negotiation. The raccoon had eventually left on its own terms. The balcony railing had not been so fortunate and was now leaning at an angle that suggested it had given up entirely. 28. A young woman told her landlord that she had decided to install a bidet attachment herself after watching what she described as a very reassuring tutorial online, and that the bathroom had responded to her installation with what she could only describe as a completely disproportionate amount of water pressure for a room of that size. She said she had turned the valve gently, and that the word gently clearly meant something different to the pipes than it did to her, because within 40 seconds the bathroom floor had achieved a depth of water she had not thought possible in a residential setting. The landlord found her sitting on the bathroom counter waiting for help with her shoes in her hands. 29. A man explained to his landlord that the smoke detector in the hallway had been going off repeatedly for several days over what he described as completely minor cooking incidents that did not warrant that level of dramatic response, and that he had eventually decided to deal with it directly and permanently. The landlord asked what directly and permanently meant in this context, and the man pointed at the ceiling where the smoke detector used to be, along with a section of drywall approximately the size of a dinner plate that had come down with it during the removal process. He said he had not anticipated the detector being quite so attached to the ceiling structurally. 30. A woman sent her landlord a very detailed message explaining that her sourdough starter had overflowed its container during the peak of the pandemic and had spread across the kitchen counter and formed what she could only describe as a chemical bond with the countertop surface that no scraping tool or cleaning product had been able to break in the months since it happened. She had consulted 3 people online, and one of them had a chemistry background, and even he had no explanation for what the starter had done to the laminate. The landlord chipped at the counter with a butter knife during his inspection and looked up at her slowly, with an expression she said she would never forget. 31. A man told his landlord that his new mattress had arrived for delivery, and that the old mattress had needed to leave the apartment immediately to make room, and that in the heat of the moment, the window had seemed significantly faster and more practical than navigating the narrow staircase. He said he had not fully thought through the geometry of the situation before committing to the plan, and that the window frame had suffered some consequences that he felt were honestly understandable given the circumstances. The landlord looked at the broken frame, then at the mattress 3 floors below in the parking lot, and asked how long he had lived there before making this decision. 32. A young woman called her landlord excitedly to explain that she had decided to remove the old wallpaper in the bedroom as a surprise renovation gift, and that things had been going very well until she realized approximately 4 strips in that the wallpaper and the wall were not 2 separate things, but were in fact the same thing and had been for quite some time. She said she had tried to stop at that point, but that stopping had somehow made the situation considerably worse than continuing would have. The landlord arrived to find an entire bedroom wall that looked like it had lost an argument with someone who meant well but had no business being near a scraper. 33. A father called his landlord to explain that his toddler had somehow located a permanent marker. I had been given access to a completely unsupervised Saturday afternoon and had found a room that had not been properly locked, and that beyond those 3 facts he genuinely did not have any additional information to offer about what had taken place or how it had escalated to the level it had. The landlord walked through the room in silence for almost 2 full minutes before speaking. Every wall, the ceiling in one corner, and a section of the carpet had been covered in a mural that the toddler seemed extremely proud of based on his expression when they found him still holding the marker. 34. A woman told her landlord that she had noticed an unusual smell coming from somewhere in the apartment, and had become convinced after several days of investigation that the source was somewhere inside the walls, and had taken it upon herself to investigate the walls personally and directly. She found no smell inside the walls. She did find that the smell had actually been coming from under the kitchen sink the entire time, which she discovered only after she had already opened up 2 sections of drywall in the living room. The landlord asked why she had not checked under the sink first, and she said in hindsight that was an excellent question that she wished someone had asked her sooner. 35. A young man explained to his landlord that he had purchased a baby gate to keep his dog out of the bedroom and had mounted it into the wall using what he described as a confident amount of force, and that the wall had responded to his confidence in a way that suggested they had very different ideas about what that wall was capable of supporting. He said the gate itself was fine and was still functioning perfectly, which he felt demonstrated that his installation technique was not entirely without merit. The landlord looked at the chunks of drywall on the floor around the gate and said the wall's opinion on the matter seemed fairly clearly expressed. 36. A woman contacted her landlord to report that her air fryer had been behaving in increasingly erratic and unpredictable ways ever since it had received a firmware update the previous month, and that the burn marks on the kitchen counter were a direct result of the appliance acting completely outside of its normal parameters through no fault of her own. She said she had checked the manufacturer's website, and other people in the reviews were also complaining about the update, and that she felt this was a very important piece of context. The landlord asked how a firmware update caused counterburns, and she said that was exactly the question the manufacturer was refusing to answer. 37. A teenage girl told her landlord that the damage to the bathroom tiles was the result of a TikTok trend she had been participating in, and that if he watched the original video, he would understand immediately why everything had unfolded the way it did, because it made complete sense in context. The landlord asked her to simply explain what the trend involved, and she said it was very difficult to describe accurately without the visual component, and that the explanation would lose a lot without watching the actual video first. He watched the video, he watched it twice. He said watching it had given him more questions than answers, and she said that was kind of the whole point of the trend. 38. A man called his landlord to explain that his neighbor's fence had collapsed onto his side of the property during a storm, and that he had reacted to the situation in the moment and may have directed some of his frustration at a surface that, upon reflection, had not been directly responsible for the fence collapse in the first place. He said emotions had been running high and that the sequence of events had moved faster than his decision-making process had been able to keep up with. The landlord asked which surface he had retaliated against, and the man said it was the garden wall and that it had looked very guilty at the time given where it was standing. 39. A woman told her landlord that she had decided to teach herself drywall texturing using a YouTube tutorial that had been uploaded in 2009 by a man who had spoken with enormous confidence throughout the entire video, and that she had trusted that confidence completely and followed every step exactly as demonstrated. The results had not matched the video. She said the man in the tutorial had made it look genuinely simple, and that she felt some responsibility lay with him for projecting a level of ease that the process had absolutely not delivered in real life. The landlord looked at the textured wall, which appeared to have been finished by someone in the middle of a very vivid dream, and said nothing for a considerable amount of time. 40. A couple told their landlord that they had purchased a recliner chair, and that during the process of positioning it in the living room, a brief but passionate disagreement had broken out between them about where exactly it should go, and that the baseboard along the south wall had lost its will to remain attached to anything during the argument. They were unclear on the precise moment it had happened, because things had moved quickly, and both of them had slightly different accounts of the sequence of events. The landlord looked at the baseboard lying flat on the floor, and then at the couple who were still subtly disagreeing about the chair's current position, even as he stood there inspecting the damage. 41. A man called his landlord to explain that his college roommate had come to visit for the weekend, and that somewhere between Friday evening and Sunday afternoon, they had collectively forgotten that they were both grown adults with responsibilities, and that the bathroom door handle, the kitchen light fixture, and one section of the hallway wall had all become casualties of a weekend that had gotten away from them in ways he was still processing emotionally. He said they had meant well at every stage, and that each individual decision had seemed completely reasonable at the time it was made, and that it was only when viewed as a complete sequence that things looked as bad as they currently did. 42. A woman told her landlord that she had purchased an at-home escape room kit for a fun evening activity, and that the clues had led her and her friends through several rooms of the apartment in a way that had eventually arrived somewhere structurally inconvenient that she had not anticipated when she had agreed to host the event. She said the kit had not come with any warning about potential property implications, and that she felt the manufacturer bore some responsibility for not including clearer guidance about which types of surfaces participants should avoid interacting with during the puzzle-solving process. The landlord found a section of the hallway closet wall that had been clearly opened from the inside with significant enthusiasm. 43. An older woman contacted her landlord to report that the bathtub faucet had been dripping consistently for 3 weeks, and that she had finally taken matters into her own hands and applied a solution that had successfully eliminated the dripping problem while simultaneously introducing an entirely new and separate problem that she admitted was arguably worse than the original dripping had been. She said she wanted credit for fixing the first issue before any conversation began about the second issue, because she felt that context was important and that her intentions throughout the entire process had been completely honorable, even if the outcomes had not fully reflected that. The landlord turned on the tap, and water came out of the wall instead of the faucet. 44. And a man sent his landlord a carefully worded message explaining that his Peloton and he had experienced a particularly difficult morning session earlier that week, and that by the end of it, the relationship between him and the bike had deteriorated to a point where keeping it in the same room as the wall it had previously been positioned next to was no longer a realistic option for either of them. He said the situation had been building for several weeks, and that the wall damage was really just the visible result of a much deeper incompatibility between his fitness journey and the structural limitations of the apartment. The landlord arrived to find the Peloton in the hallway facing the front door like it was trying to leave. 45. A young woman explained to her landlord that she had decided to soundproof her home office herself, using materials she had selected at the hardware store based on what the packaging had described as professional, grade acoustic performance, and that the ceiling had disagreed with her installation method in a way that had become apparent within 48 hours of the project being completed. She said she had done research beforehand and had felt genuinely prepared going in, and that the ceiling's reaction had been completely disproportionate to the work she had done, considering she had followed the instructions on the packaging almost entirely. The landlord looked up at the ceiling tiles hanging at various angles and asked how many she had glued up there, and she said she had lost count around 30. 46. An uncle called his landlord late on a Friday evening to explain that he had consumed a generous amount of wine at dinner and had become absolutely convinced during dessert that relocating the light switch on the kitchen wall was something he was fully capable of doing that same evening, and that he was calling now from a position of sobriety and regret to report that he could not in fact relocate a light switch under any conditions, and certainly not the ones that had existed that Friday night. He said the wall now had 3 holes in it because the first 2 locations he had chosen had turned out to be wrong, and that by the 3rd attempt, his confidence had finally caught up with reality. 47. A man contacted his landlord to explain that he had purchased a furniture set that required self-assembly and that the packaging had described the process as straightforward and suitable for one person, but had failed to mention anywhere on the box that a structural engineering degree would have been an extremely helpful prerequisite for completing the project safely and without incident. He said he had spent 4 hours on it and had made consistent progress right up until the final stage, where a single misread diagram had resulted in an outcome that neither he nor the furniture designer could have fully predicted. The landlord found a wardrobe door fixed firmly into the ceiling at an angle that suggested it had arrived there with considerable force and commitment. 48. A woman called her landlord after a large family Thanksgiving gathering to explain that her very extended family had visited for the holiday and that the bathroom had seen a volume of traffic over those 2 days that she felt no reasonable door hinge could have been expected to endure, and that the hinge had ultimately made its own decision about how long it was willing to continue participating in the situation. She said she wanted to be clear that the hinge had not been forced or mishandled by anyone specifically, and that it had simply reached its limit organically over the course of a very long and very well-attended holiday meal. The landlord said he had never heard a hinge described as having made a personal decision before, and she said there was a first time for everything. 49. A man left his landlord a voicemail explaining that he had rented a pressure washer to clean the patio on a Sunday afternoon, and that the results on the patio had been so immediately impressive and satisfying that his confidence had expanded naturally from there in a direction that had eventually led him indoors, and that he was calling to discuss some of the consequences of that expansion. He said the pressure washer had performed exactly as advertised, and that if anything, the manufacturer deserved some recognition for building a product that worked that well, because it was genuinely the effectiveness of the machine that had made it so difficult to stop once he had started. The landlord arrived to find the kitchen wall tiles completely clean and also completely gone, and there you have it. 49 people who looked their landlord dead in the eye and chose chaos over accountability with 0 regrets whatsoever. If any of these excuses made you laugh, cry, or question humanity entirely, then you are absolutely in the right place here on BrainFumble. Hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next disaster. Share this with someone who has a landlord or is a landlord because they need this today. Now tell us in the comments, which excuse would you actually try to pull off if you had to pick just one?